Thank you for joining us here at Victory Church. My name is Becky, and I'm the worship director here, and we pray that this sermon blesses your life today. Don't forget to click and subscribe so you never miss a message.
I'll never forget, several years ago, I was going through an introduction to Christianity with a group of college students, and one who had just really grown up with nothing. And we came to this point of Jesus, of why did he die? And she was cool with that, with what he taught and what he said. But when it came to the resurrection, she had a really hard time believing it. Because she didn't grow up with it. It's just a really hard thing to believe. And that's something that's completely natural, is to have those kinds of doubts, because you may be familiar with miracles happening in your own life. You may be familiar with some people being almost dead and coming back. But you probably don't know anybody outside of Jesus who's been dead for a while, for like 2 nights, 3 days, who spent a 3-day, 2 nights in the tomb and getting back up. And I remember as you read the New Testament, it's like hinges everything on the message, Christian message hinges on the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. The Apostle Paul one time was standing in front of a crowd and called the Areopagus. He was in Greece, and he was sharing them all about Jesus. And it was at this point, though, when he shared the resurrection of the dead, the Bible says, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some sneered, but others said, we want to hear you again on the subject. It was natural that some sneered. They made fun of him and wanted to throw him out. But others were captured, at least, by the life that Jesus had lived and what he taught, that they didn't just throw it out. But it's natural to question it. But we know, as we read, as you come to the conclusion, that the resurrection of the dead and the gospel is just as what Paul wrote. He said, and if Christ had not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. Because if Jesus hadn't been raised from the dead, he's just one of many. A guy who taught some really good things. Confucius has some stuff that makes sense. You can throw some Buddha in there. Everybody has some worldly wisdom that makes sense. But the fact that we have the one who wasn't reincarnated, but actually rose from the dead, says this one is the truth. This is the guy. And this is what gives credibility to the Christian faith. So over the next few weeks, we're going to address some of the common doubts about the resurrection using not just the Bible, but using evidence and logic. And we'll be pulling from some resources that specialized in coming up with evidence. So this is not my research, okay? But there are some people who have done the research and really took deep dives into it. And often there are people who are in the sneering category, who want to prove the resurrection as being false because it doesn't make sense, that want to prove that point. Then they go dive into the evidence to try to prove that it didn't happen, and then find out proving that it actually did happen, and coming to faith themselves and realizing that it's the truth. So today, we're going to address the doubt that did Jesus actually die on the cross? That's the doubt we're going to handle today. Did Jesus actually die on the cross? And we're going to rely heavily on a book, some of you may know this from, called The Case for Christ, written by the journalist Lee Strobel, the investigative journalist Lee Strobel, who makes his case. And he's one of those guys who made a case, really is trying to make a case against the resurrection, and then end up proving him right and then converting himself. And I always love those stories where somebody accidentally converts themselves to Christianity because they just read it and they go, wow, I was against this, but I didn't know anything, so I wanted to know something, and then I found out that knowing everything in terms of knowing Jesus. So this is from Lee Strobel. And he shares this, he says there's a funny story of a family. We talk about, did Jesus actually die on the cross? There's a funny story about a family that liked to travel by train. I don't know how many people do that anymore, but it is a great way to travel. When I lived in the Midwest, you would travel like this a lot of different times. And the reason they were traveling by train was during the winter months, they would go see family. And if you've ever been in like upper Wisconsin and Michigan and Canada, it's a mess. I mean, we had a sudden rainstorm. Well, they have sudden blizzards. They have ice. They have winter storms can make traveling extremely treacherous just like that. And so they would often just travel by train to avoid it. It was much more safe, more secure. And so they'd travel by train, but eventually something would typically happen. The train would stop, something would happen. And this one time, they were traveling through rural Wisconsin, in the northern part of Wisconsin, and they were traveling, and then the train lurched and then came to a sudden stop. And what had happened, a cow had wandered onto the tracks. And the train, they looked out the window, and you could see the cow half buried in a snowbank, way off to the side. And because that happened, the train had to stop, the local authorities had to come out, they had a whole big mess that they had to clean up, and I'm not talking a gruesome mess. They just had a paperwork mess, with the police, everybody involved in this. So it took them a while to get going again, and so finally the train started going, and they ran to the back of the train so they could see outside the caboose really like what exactly happened. And the last thing that they saw was this cow, which was half buried in snow, twitch, move, shake its head a little bit, stand up, and walk away. And laid back down on the tracks again. Not the smartest animals, all right, but they did that. So you can, based on the evidence that they saw, they would conclude that, based on the evidence, they could conclude that was the cow miraculously raised from the dead, or B, had the cow been stunned and eventually revived? I think we'd come to the conclusion B, right? That's what I would do, surprisingly. And that's a popular choice, though, for some people when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus. May feel like it makes a lot of sense, but if you just read the story from the Bible, you don't understand the things that happened to him. We don't understand Roman floggings. We don't really necessarily understand crucifixion. The story is basically told like we tell a child, like, what did Jesus do for you? He died on the cross, and he died for my sins. I don't know much about that. I just see pictures of a guy hanging. So how do you know? And people look at that, and if that's all they know about the story, you might assume, well, maybe he just got better in the cool of the tomb because he got buried and he laid down, he rested, he had an exhausting week, and maybe he just passed out from exhaustion that made him look dead, then later just revived in the cool, damp air of the tomb. The Bible also tells us that Jesus said, I thirst, and then somebody gave him something called wine vinegar mixed in and then put it up to his lips and he drank. Conspiracy theorists, any of you out there conspiracy theorists? They drugged him, right? They drugged him like maybe they took that and they gave him some kind of drug that would, that ninja sleep, where your body just your heart stops beating and they think you're dead. If you've watched any spy movies, like that, they think you're dead. Or Romeo and Juliet, that was a thing. Huh? The fall of the house of Usher by Poe. But you've got these different things where there's something that would stop your heartbeat So maybe this happened. And then the Bible also tells us that maybe caused some surprise. And why we read our reading for this morning is that even Pilate was surprised, right? He was surprised, like, wow, he's dead already? Interesting. He surprised him. So, okay, what does that mean? So all these things, Kevin, that maybe would explain why the tomb would be empty, because there were no corpses to bury. And Jesus then could walk and talk and eat with the disciples. But what happens when we look at what actually happened to Jesus on that Good Friday? And if you've watched The Passion of the Christ, anybody watched The Passion of the Christ? 2004. I've realized it's been out for 20 years already. You probably have a fairly decent and realistic idea visually of what happened. I brought up here just a simple example of a crown of thorns. Like, we have 3 of these in our decoration cabinet here for church. And notice how I'm carrying it. Very carefully, yeah. I'm carrying it very carefully because this is dangerous. I've already hit myself once already just holding it like this, and it hurts, and I can't imagine. And this one has been put together so, yeah, it would hurt, but I've got another one that would hurt more than another one that would be like, you could actually kind of wear it. It looks pointy on the outside, but not on the inside. But this is, think about him wearing just simply this, and the pain of something that was really a throwaway in terms of the torture that he went under. This is to make fun versus the real stuff that really got him. And one of the things that happened to him that we need to talk about is the Roman flogging. The Roman flogging by the Romans, and flogging we see as being whipped. He's tied to a post, hands tied to a post, and he's flogged. And the flogging in the Roman Empire followed a very predictable and consistent pattern. So it wasn't like one person got off easy. Usually it's you got the full thing, and then that's if you got off easy. It could be worse depending on the person actually conducting it. The soldier would use a whip of braided leather thongs with metal balls woven into them. And when the whip would strike the flesh, these balls would cause deep bruises, which would often break open with further blows. And then the whip had pieces of sharp bone as well, which would cut into the flesh. By the way, it's going to get gruesome, so if you've got a weak stomach, it's okay, all right? It's okay if you say, all right, I'm out. But it would expose rip the bleeding flesh. And then it'll go from the back of the person being flogged would be so shredded that the part of the spine would sometimes be exposed by the deep cuts. The lash of the whip would go all the way from the shoulders to the back, the buttocks, and the back of the legs. The whip would tear into underlying muscles to produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh and sometimes even expose internal organs. And usually flogging consisted of 39 lashes, although the soldier might inflict more, depending on his mood. And many people died before they even got to the crucifixion. And those who didn't die often simply went into shock. And by the time the soldiers were done flogging Jesus, he would have been in serious condition even before the first nail had been driven in to hang him on the cross. Now, that's just like part one. And then you have the humiliation of the crown of thorns. You have the humiliation of soldiers beating him with their fists, putting the robe on him and all the stuff. You have that part of the humiliation. And remember that as we read the story, Pilate didn't really want to crucify Jesus. He thought that this was going to be enough for this crowd to witness something this brutal and to satisfy like their bloodlust, that this will be enough. But then they came back, and he's standing there in his bloody mess, and they say, well, who do you want? Do you want this guy? Do you want Barabbas? We want Barabbas, and we still want you to crucify this guy. And they demanded his crucifixion. Now, that first part was horrible enough, and now we come to crucifixion. And remember, if people, when they doubt that he died, the crucifixion was and is an instrument of execution. There's no, did we get it right? Did we not? It wasn't an exact, this is what they did. It was like a guillotine. You knew when somebody was dead. And the days they condemned criminals, they strapped them. In the days where we have, when we do executions, we have condemned criminals and they're strapped down and they're injected with poison. And the circumstances are highly controlled. There's a doctor on board to proclaim death. But sometimes people look at the crucifixion, well, it's an unexact science. How do we really know? Was there anybody taking his pulse, his heartbeat, his blood pressure? But we know pretty certain that he died there, because most people were just not sure how he died. And without a trained medical examiner to officially cause the time of death, how exactly did he die? And maybe could he have experienced this brutalized and beating, but somehow still be alive? There's people who have that doubt. Could he still be alive? And think about that cow that had got hit by that train. What did you assume? Right? Somehow he got back up. Well, let's look at the process of the crucifixion. When Jesus arrived at the site where he was to be crucified, he would have been, and remember, his back, shoulders, all the way through his legs have been exposed. He would have been laid down with his arms outstretched out on a large beam, and the executioner would have taken 2 sharp spikes, each 5 to 7 inches long, and nailed one through each wrist into the beam. Now, the question is, well, wrist, it says hands. Well, hands or wrists, nearly all the pictures of Jesus on the cross show the nails going through Jesus' palms. Thomas says, I want to see the nails in his hands. Probably because the Bible mentions the marks in Jesus' hands. But actually the Romans drove the spikes into their victims' wrists, which was actually considered to be part of the hand. The wrist was considered to be part of the hand. So the bones in the hand, because if you just think about it yourself, and I don't recommend you doing this at home, but if you think about it yourself, if driving it through your hand, are you going to support your body weight? It's going to just tear, as your body would sag on the cross, it would just tear through and shred through your palms, and you just fall off the cross. So as the nails pierced the wrist, they would have crushed the large nerve that goes to the hand. And think about your funny bone. How many of you have banged your funny bone before? Okay, we all have had that. Now you've experienced what it is to jar a nerve. Now imagine taking pliers and squeezing that nerve in your funny bone, and then you have an idea of what the spikes did to the nerves going to his hands. So that's just this little part. And then for this first step of the process, the horizontal beam was lying on the ground, not yet attached to the vertical beam. And at that point, Jesus was hoisted as the crossbar was attached to a vertical stake, picked up, and then the executioner then drove nails through his feet, crushing and severing the nerves there. And immediately Jesus' arms would have been stretched by his body weight hanging on them. And scientists tell us that his arms would have been pulled about 6 inches longer because his shoulders would dislocate by the strain. And then, that's just that. And then the actual cause of death isn't bleeding out. The cause of death is suffocation. Because once a person is hanging in the vertical position, in order to exhale, the person being crucified must push up on his feet. And when he did that, the nails would tear through the feet until they eventually locked up against the ankle bones. And after he managed to exhale, the person would then be able to relax and take another breath in. And again, he had to push himself up to exhale, scraping your back that's exposed against the rough wood of the cross. And this would go on until complete exhaustion would take over, and the person wouldn't be able to push up anymore and breathe. And the person's breathing would slow down, the lack of oxygen would lead to an erratic heartbeat, and eventually cardiac arrest. And the combination of shock, a rapid heart rate, and heart failure results in a collection of clear, watery fluid around the heart and the lungs. We call this the separation of the blood and the serum. An incision through the lung and heart would release the fluid as well as the blood. And the Apostle John described this medical phenomenon in the account of the crucifixion, and they weren't really sure what it was. They didn't know how it happened. They just knew it did happen. And he wrote, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. When we talk about piercing his side, it was a piercing into his side, up into his heart, releasing flow of blood and water. So Dr. William D. Edwards, who's writing in the Journal of the American Medical Association, drew this conclusion about the crucifixion. He said, clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. The assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appears to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. But remember, that's our first doubt. Did Jesus die? It's very, very unlikely that after suffering all of that, somebody would heal in the cool of the tomb. We did leg day. Aaron and I did leg day. We're working out, did leg day, and I did my first day a couple weeks ago. I couldn't walk for the rest of the day, or the next day, or for 3 days. And we expect Jesus to just somehow waltz out of the tomb. But agreeing that Jesus died is a long way from believing that he rose from the dead. We're going to talk about that next week. You got to come back, all right? But what I want you to think about right now, though, I know that hearing and that reading through what we just talked about is hard. Like I said earlier, I remember as a group when the Passion of the Christ came out, 2004, I was still living in San Jose. And being a downtown church, you have a lot of downtown things. We had a downtown theater. And we organized a group to go see this together. And then the people who put out the Passion of the Christ and some other Christian group gave us great resource materials to go and discuss the Passion of the Christ. And so we had it all set up so that we would go watch the movie together. We could walk to the theater. It was only a block away. Then we'd walk back to the church, and we'd have coffee and snacks and discuss the movie. I remember after that, nobody wanted to talk. I didn't want to talk. You just wanted to go home. And that was even after they rolled the stone away at the end, and you saw him alive victoriously. It was... None of us had ever seen anything like that before. We read the story, maybe even read this kind of an account. We'd seen the movies, The Greatest Story Ever Told, and None of it was ever like that. And so we were really quiet. Even for those who believe in the resurrection, it's horrible what happened. But today, I don't want you to have, okay, this is great. But I want you to think about this. And my mind is drawn to a phrase in Hebrews. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. So I want you to think about all that we just shared. From this to the flogging, enduring the cross, not just enduring death, but enduring the cross. How great that joy is. That he would do all of that for the joy set before him. How great is that joy to go all through all that? The joy of returning to the Father and bringing us with him. The joy of salvation for humanity, for all who would believe in him, who would bring us with him, bringing us all in our tattered rags of this life, in who we are and what we deserve, and then giving us new life. That joy, that's how much he loves you. That's how much he loves us. That's how much he loves the person sitting next to you. That's how much he loves your neighbors. That's how much he loves the people of your past, the people of your future. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, and you are that joy.